Okay, hi everyone, SmithyQ, SmithyQ.com. We're on to number 6 of the opening survey. And today we're going to be talking about, I suppose, the next most popular opening after against 1e4, which is the Caro-Kann. Now, this one's a kind of a funny opening because there are 3 main variations of the Caro-Kann that white can try from this position, or maybe even 4 if you want to count the exchange and the Panov as separate. And they're all quite distinct from each other. So this kind of makes it slightly strange. Many black defenses, for instance, we talked about the French. 90% or so of the games eventually have white playing e5 and getting this type of pawn structure. It's very, very common. This is essentially why you play the French defense, is because you want to play against this pawn structure. But the Caro-Kann, we don't get that at all. And so this is one reason why I don't play the Caro-Kann. I tried for a little bit. It's completely different types of games depending on what white does. And as black, I have no control over what white does, and that's it. So there's 3 main lines. We'll look at the classical one first, because it's probably the most logical, and this is the one that I would assume most Caro-Kann players want to do. And first, if we just want to look at this just in the most general way, is that black is, again, like the French, he's challenging white center with this d5 push. That's the whole idea. But unlike the French, this bishop can come out. So this is basically the guiding idea of the Caro-Kann. It's challenging the center with d5, but still trying to find a good spot for this bishop. And we can see this most clearly in the classical line, where after white defends the pawn, black's going to take it. And then we can see it clearly where the bishop attacks the knight. And then from here, the most common move would be this, pushing it back. Usually we'll have something like knight f3, knight d7. White very often tries to throw in this h4, trying to gain space. And we'll see something like this, chasing the bishop back before simply exchanging it and reach here. And this is a fairly typical position for the Caro-Kann. I believe this is known as the Capablanca variation, but don't quote me on that. The names aren't so important, it's the ideas that matter. And from here, white actually has a 3-move lead in development, or he has 3 pieces out. He can put this bishop usually on d2. He often castles queenside, precisely because he's thrown that h-pawn up the board early. And white has a simple, he argues at least, that he has a simple space advantage in this position. And black, he's going to counter-argue by saying that he has absolutely no weakness. It's not so easy for white to actually attack in this position. What's white going to do? It's a pair of the light squared bishops have already been traded. And then black is going to essentially play e6. Notice how he has these pawns on light squares. Well, he has a dark square bishop. So the position, positionally, strategically, is absolutely excellent. That's exactly what he wants. He has very thematic development. He's going to put his knight, let me just delete this. Knight goes to f6. Queen usually goes to c7. Sometimes he can go somewhere else. And black will usually castle queenside as well. Though if he wants, he can play bishop e7 and then just castle this way. And so the appeal for black in this position is that he has simple position with no weaknesses. He's got thematic development for his pieces. And then sooner or later, he's going to either strike out with c5 or e5 and try and claim an equal game. Whereas white is trying to maintain his space advantage, and play tends to be more positional in nature. It's more long-term, and the games are often decided in the endgame. Can black break free and get complete equality, or does white space, eventually he's going to move these knights. Let me guess, sorry, I'll do these arrows. So knights come here, knights go here, the pawns can start marching, and white is going to try and press black that way. I'll be fairly honest, these positions are perfectly satisfactory. I find them, though, very dull, for a lack of a better word. It's not so easy for stuff to happen. Never been a big fan, and I believe many people feel this way as well, because this is becoming less and less the main line. Many white players are trying the other two. Again, this is perfectly fine, and white's got a good game. If anything, white is better, right? It's not, it's either equal or better for white, but it can be hard to actually press for more. You're really relying on black misplaying the resulting middle game and end game, which isn't so fun. And so this is partly why the other two possibilities have a lot of adherence, especially at the amateur level. Perhaps what's become the main line is E5, which is known as the advanced variation. And if black were to play E6 here, this is somewhat of a mistake, because now it's just like a French defense. The bishop is stuck behind the pawn, and it's going to take longer for him to eventually play C5. So the whole point of the Caro-Kann is to get the bishop out, and then to play E6 after. What's really interesting about this is even though the pawn structure is going to be quite similar to the French defense, the positions, stylistically, they tend to play very differently. This bishop is on the outside, and so in theory it's good, but it's also an object for attack. And there's some fun variations where white is going to start throwing his g-pawn up the board, and then he throws the h-pawn up the board, right? And you can even, I guess, keep throwing these pawns. And these pawns are just absolutely marching all the way forward. And it's constantly hitting at that bishop. And so the bishop is much better, right? This is a great diagonal for the bishop. But white's attack, white's pawns, are also gaining a lot of time by hitting that bishop. And so there's a give and take. It's not simply a better French defense, as it otherwise might have been. It's also... sorry, let me back up. Extremely common, actually, is this h4 idea, doing it first. And I've played this in my blitz games, and it very often, if black has never seen it before, he'll just play e6, and this actually loses the bishop. Because after g5, doesn't matter where the bishop goes, you go, okay, backs up, it's going to get hit by this pawn, it goes here, gets hit by this pawn, and the bishop is completely trapped. So the bishop is actually too active for its own good. By playing e6, it stopped the bishop from, not that, it stopped the bishop, it stopped the bishop from retreating back to where it came. Which is why, in response to h4, black would typically need to play either h6 or h5 himself, and then continue on with development. Beyond that, so white does gain this idea of attacking the bishop. Black's idea is very similar to the French defense, in that he will play e6 eventually. He's going to hit back the center with c5, and much of the development is the same. However, hopefully this bishop makes his life easier, and certainly the endgames are not the automatic potential weakness as they are in the other variation. And so the advance, possibly the main line. It's also possible for white, I should just be clear, to not play so hyper-aggressive, and to simply play along the lines of what's known as the short variation. Something like this, and where white can later play c3 or c4, depending on what he wants, and he's just playing simple, solid chess, trying to argue that he simply has a space advantage, and he's going to press later on. So again, there's multiple ideas, though again, it's the black's ideas are pretty much always the same. He's going to hit back with knight c5, and he's going to be trying to pressure the center with one of these pawn breaks, as always. And so we've had two variations there. We've had the classical variation, where there's the I'll just put it on the board, where there's the exchange of pawns in the beginning, and then the bishop will come out. There is then the advanced variation, where the center becomes locked, where the center is closed, and then black is probably going to hit back the pawn. But if he gets his bishop out, which is the main idea, it can be an object of attack from the onrushing white pawns. So that's quite interesting. And then the final main variation, I guess it's technically two variations, depending how you look at it, is the exchange. And then white has an option here. White can either play, well, does white play c4 or not? It's very possible for white in this position to just play completely normal development. And one idea here, in fact, both of these variations are designed to hit against this bishop, to make it not develop normally. We can see we played bishop d3, and so the bishop can't come to f5. Let's say normal development, and white will often play h3. And so we'll see here, the bishop cannot come to g4, and then the bishop cannot come to f5, which means the bishop probably doesn't want to be on, it can't go there. It probably doesn't want to be on e6. d7 isn't that good either. And does that mean it's trying to develop over here? Frig. Like this. It stares at its own pawn. Maybe it tries to exchange itself here. But he has to be very careful, because there's a common tactic. Take, take, but then queen a4 check, which hits the king, and it hits the knight. And so there's no guarantee that black gets that bishop into the game. Or more accurately, there's no easy way to get that bishop in, which is, of course, the main idea of the Caro-Kann. And this can be a very effective practical weapon, I find. It's something that I've enjoyed more and more as I've matured in my chess approach. Simply trying to keep that bishop out of the game. And white, again, in a position like this, he's got super easy development. He's going to play knight f3, he's going to castle, probably play c3, bishop can go anywhere, knight goes here, usually this knight comes to all the way to e5, and then white can either play in the center, the king side, the queen side, wherever. And black is a bit more passive. Or, that is, it's not like he has an attack, it's not like he's got easy development, it's not completely clear what black has. Like, it's equal, but it's more equal for white, shall we say. Potentially, at least. And this is certainly true at the amateur level. At the amateur level, the exchange variation tends to do quite well statistically. And then there's the final option, the option which I've probably played the most, though I've tried them all at various times. And this is with c4, which is going to lead, after an eventual take, black shouldn't take right away, but just to show it, with the isolated pawn. And this is a classic isolated pawn, because black still has the pawn on e6, so the c file is open. The other day I showed the French defense, and my favorite way of, my favorite way of playing against the French is take, take, like so. Now this is a different type of isolated pawn position, because there's no e-pawn. The e-file is completely open. This is somewhat less standard than the c6 version here. This is much more common and very typical of the various Queen's Gambits and the Queen's Gambit acceptance. Just, you know, FYI. And this is going to lead to, again, much different play than all the other variations, because it's an isolated pawn. And so that means there's typical isolated queen pawn activity, where white is going to tend to develop very, very quickly. He's going to castle. Often he's going to put his knight right here on the center, right here on e5, and he's going to try to attack. His rook's going to open the files, and he's going to do something. Very, very common is trying to move the d-pawn forward, usually as a sacrifice. And that's just going to completely open the game up. Black, for his part, is trying to play more slowly. He wants to exchange pieces and then exploit the endgame weakness of the d-pawn. The reason I really like this is, well, again, it's a nice open position. Open positions are great, and it's similar to my favorite variation against the French. It's just, it's got easy development, and you got attacking chance. It's pretty nice. And I guess I'm not very good at the endgame, and so who cares? I have an endgame weakness. I'd probably lose the endgame anyway, right? That's how I used to think about these positions. One of the nice things is that if black tries to develop, sorry, let me back up. So again, black very rarely shouldn't take here. He should wait until the bishop moves and then take, so the bishop moves twice, right? We've covered this before in others. So often we'll get something like this. You know, let's say, you know, both knights develop. And one thing that black needs to be very careful about is that if he moves this bishop early, like it's possible, he needs to be very worried, or he has to be very careful about whether this queen b3, which is hitting this, it's hitting this, it's breaking the pin. And if black, he can certainly take, and it ruins the white's pawn structure, and that's great. But that, he's given up the two bishops. And this position is completely wide open, and now there's an open g-file, and white is playing on pure dynamics. And when I tried to play the Caro-Kann as black, This is the type of position that at first I thought was great because white's pawn structure is terrible, especially who's after something like taking where he's got the isolated pawn. But white's pieces are so active, and his bishops in particular are so active, and even though you might win a pawn, as black, it seems as if you're always defending, you're always on the back foot, and I scored terribly in this position. It's by far the position that I was terrible at. And so often, black will not develop the bishop early. He'll do something like e6, just reinforcing the center. But then the bishop's kind of stuck, if I could draw the arrow, right? It's stuck behind its own pawn. And so by playing this way, we are, just like with the exchange variation, trying to play against black's main idea, which is getting that harmonious, simple development and getting his bishop out before we lock it into the pawn chain. I don't want to give the impression that the Caro-Kann is a bad opening. However, I probably am doing that just because my experience with it is almost entirely been negative. For the exact reasons that I described, is that there's 4 main variations there, where we have the classical with knight c3, we have the exchange variation without c4, the exchange with c4, and then the advanced variation. And so 4 stylistically very different positions you need to be aware of as black. And because of that, that makes it you have to like all those positions to really play the Caro-Kann, because they're all fairly common. I think the advance is now the most common, but you can't, if you don't like any one of those positions, by playing the Caro-Kann, you cannot guarantee you get a position you like. And so it's putting a lot of, you have to be a very universal player. You have to like a lot of positions to really play the Caro-Kann well, or at least all of these variations. Whereas it's white who gets to dominate the choice. If white wants, a simple, easy position, he can play the classical with knight c3. Or if he wants that aggressive attack, he can play the advance with g5 and h5. Or if he wants to play for a simple advantage, he can simply take. And then, again, play against your bishop. It's white who decides the game, and it's black who has to play along. And I find, personally, stylistically, I do not enjoy that at all. If I'm playing a black asymmetrical opening, so I'm not just copying white's first move, e4, e5, then I want to at least dictate the play somewhat. I want to, set the playing field. Whereas, from my perspective at least, with the Caro-Kann is you're completely letting white decide the game, how he wants to play, and then you're simply reacting. Now, is the Caro-Kann sound? Yeah, it's great. Is it possible to put some more life into it and have black really play for some winning chances? It is, yes, but it's certainly not so easy, and it requires a lot more preparation on the second player's part. It probably is the most positional or strategic of the main opening choices against 1e4, but it's not my main recommendation. Both from playing with it and against it, that's it. The opening coming up, the Scandinavian, attempts to be an improved version of the Caro-Kann, and we'll see that in that next video. But for that, this is a general take on the ideas of the Caro-Kann. Again, I'm not really recommending you play it as black. There's several recent books that have tried to really weaponize it, but that's getting pretty advanced, and it wouldn't be a good introduction to the Caro-Kann. I honestly am not sure what the best introduction to the Caro-Kann is. Maybe that's why I have a negative opinion. It's because I never found that proper introduction. But as white, hopefully one of those ideas that you looked at here really speaks to you, and you like those types of positions, because that gives you something further to explore. Otherwise, that's that. Short, sweet, to the point. So that's the Caro-Kann, at least according to Smithy. So that's it. Thanks for watching, guys. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.